New York. Skyscrapers tearing the sky, people whose steps turned into a race, faces disappearing under street lamps. But that evening, for the first time, the city held its breath for a moment as Donald Trump, accompanied by his bodyguards, walked through the heart of the city. His suit was complete, his posture as erect as ever, his steps as determined. But there was a faint tiredness in his eyes. He was on his way to attend a prestigious gala nearby. Everything was planned, limited to the minute, until he heard the melody. The sound of a worn piano coming from a street corner. The timbre was not smooth. Some keys seemed to be silent. But the notes somehow seeped into his soul. Trump suddenly stopped. His bodyguard was surprised, then slowed down. In the chaos of New York, such scenes were unheard of. A politician, a billionaire figure, stopped in his tracks by the sound of music. On the edge of the cobblestones was a piano with a cracked body. At its head sat a young man, his jacket frayed, his fingers red from the cold. But it wasn't just a melody he was playing. It was a memory. It was a loss. And maybe it was a call. Trump's feet led him in that direction without him realizing it. The crowd slowly began to gather around him, but no one spoke, because everyone seemed to find something of themselves in that melody. For a moment, Trump's eyes froze. The melody was familiar. When he was a child in their Manhattan apartment, his mother would play it every Sunday morning. He would peek through the bedroom door. She never turned around and spoke. She just played it, because melodies say more than words. Trump's throat tightened. The young man still hadn't opened his eyes, but it was as if it was playing just for Trump, like a message, like an echo from the past. Trump took a step, then another. There was silence in the crowd. No cameras came out, no flashbulbs went off, because this moment was not to be documented, but to be felt. Trump's eyes filled. He felt like a little boy. He remembered those moments when his mother was silent on the piano but spoke with her heart, and a sentence echoed in his mind. Donald, music reminds you of the language your heart has forgotten. The melody continued, soft but determined. It was as if the dusty notebooks of the past were being opened one by one, each note turning a page. Trump stopped a few steps away from the young man at the piano. The young man slowly raised his head. His face was young, but his eyes seemed to be burdened by the years he had lived. There were still traces of the melody in his hands, an expression on his lips that preferred not to speak. They looked at each other for a while. The crowd was silent. Even the city seemed to fall silent. Trump asked, without averting his eyes, "How do you know this song?" The young man smiled slightly. "My mother taught it to me," he said. "When I was a child, I always heard her play this song. According to her, this melody is good for the soul of some people." Trump's lips trembled. These words, coming from a stranger, were something he hadn't said in years, not even to himself. He approached the edge of the piano. He reached his hand slowly toward the keys, but didn't touch them. "My mother used to play this piece," he said. "When she couldn't explain things, she always played it. I would try to understand, but she never spoke. The melody said it all." The young man bowed his head. "Maybe some feelings can't be put into words," he whispered. "Maybe music is like a prayer without words." Trump's eyes filled again. He stepped back for a moment, but then he stopped. He let himself go. A drop fell from his eyes, a suppressed drop that had been waiting for years, unable to come out. A boy in the crowd whispered to his mother, "Mom, why is that man crying?" She leaned over and said softly in his ear, "Because some people, when they stand strong for too long, they eventually get tired." Trump turned his gaze back to the young man. "I've never heard that melody like that," he said. "It's like I'm really listening to it for the first time." The young man didn't say anything. He just nodded, because at that moment, words were not enough. A silence fell, but this silence was not suffocating. On the contrary, it was healing. And in that moment, Trump thought for the first time, "I've talked for years, but I've never listened so much." Trump took a few steps back, but his eyes were still on the piano, as if there was a piece of his past there, like a childhood memory, broken but alive. The whispers from the crowd fell silent again. A man slowly took his phone out of his pocket, but put it back without even looking at the screen. He didn't want to break the magic of the moment, because this moment was too real to fit on a screen. Trump took a deep breath. He slowly lifted his head and began to speak. "I have been a talker all my life. I've always had answers, but sometimes you just need a question that leads you to silence." The crowd was attentive. It was as if everyone knew what that question was. But Trump answered, "Who are you, Donald?" I never asked myself that until this melody reminded me of that question. The young pianist looked up. There was no surprise on his face. It was as if he had already guessed the answer. Trump turned once more to the piano. "You know," he said, "I heard this melody from my mother's hands, but she never spoke. And now I realize I didn't say anything either. I just talked, but I didn't say it." A woman's eyes welled up. A voice from the back of the crowd said, "I'm going to tell my grandson what happened here tonight, because this is more precious than history." Trump turned to look at the person. He smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a politician. It was the smile of a man who was thankful, who understood, who felt lighter. "I've been rich," Trump said. "I've been successful. I've been known. But tonight, for the first time, I became human, because for the first time in years, I actually felt something, and it doesn't scare me." Trump stood up. The melody that had been playing on the street corner had ended, but it still echoed inside him. It was as if his mother's voice still echoed through the notes. The crowd was silent for a while. No one wanted to disturb the moment. Then an old man stepped forward. He was half-shaven, tired, but proud. "Mr. Trump," he said, "my mom used to play this song, but I've never heard her play it. You reminded me of that day." Trump bowed his head and whispered sincerely, "I didn't hear my mother for years either, but now every note sounds like her whisper." The pianist started playing again, the same melody, but this time a little heavier, deeper, like a melody that opens the thick curtains of the past. Trump closed his eyes. He thought of his mother sitting at the piano. Her hands were bony, but graceful. As she pressed the notes, it was as if she was burying all the pain of the past in the notes. Little Donald would watch her from the corner of the room. He didn't speak, but he felt. Every note was an apology, a hug, an "I love you." "I didn't realize then that my mother loved me," he said, "because she was silent. But now I realize the strongest love is experienced in silence." A few people in the crowd nodded. In that moment, everyone thought of their own mother. Trump turned to look at the young pianist. "Did you compose this melody?" The young man shook his head from side to side. "No," he said. "My mother learned this melody too. She learned it from my grandmother. Maybe it was even passed down to your mother once upon a time." A look of admiration mixed with surprise crossed Trump's face. "So, this melody has been around for years, unclaimed but immortal?" The young man nodded. "Some melodies travel through time, Mr. Trump, not knowing whose heart they will touch, but always finding the right one." As soon as Trump heard those words, he fell silent, because he was sure that the melody had found him. A gust of wind blew. The collar of Trump's jacket fluttered. At that moment, the light perfume of his mother seemed to come to his nose. Was it real? Was it imagined? But it didn't matter, because at that moment, one thing was certain. Everything he thought he had forgotten was actually hidden inside him. Trump slowly retraced his steps. The protection team was still far away, but he no longer needed their circle. At that moment, the silence inside him protected him. The crowd surrounded him like a ring, but no one spoke, because everyone felt that they were in a moment that should not be touched. A father leaned over to the boy next to him. "Look, son," he said in a low voice. "Sometimes even great men miss their childhood." Trump turned his head. The sentence he heard sent a shiver down his spine. He responded with a smile, but that smile carried the weight of years. He walked slowly around the corner of the street and headed for his hotel. As his footsteps pounded the pavement, he couldn't suppress the melody inside him. The young pianist was left behind, but his melody was still with him. This was no longer an ordinary song. It was a melody in which Trump found his inner child. Trump approached the young pianist. He put his hand on his shoulder. "You know what you remind me of?" he said. "To be human. And so the story is complete, but it's not the end. It was the beginning of a new melody, a new story of humanity. A man who had forgotten himself heard himself again in a street melody." Follow the channel and like the video for more of such moving stories.